Hi and welcome to a cEDH deck tech video for Aang at the Crossroads. Or I should rather say more of a deck tech reaction. Or maybe a card review you could also say. So full transparency, I haven't built this deck. It's actually built by Spuki, who is a cEDH content creator. I've seen him pop up in a lot of gameplay videos, so I think he's part of a content creation group at the very least. But this is basically his build. Card by card, I will leave a link in the description below of this video to this deck list if you wanna take a look at exactly how it's put together. And the price too, you can actually see it there as well. And Pontus actually played this deck in one of our gameplay videos to test it out. So I've played against it and such. And I guess here are my opinions and thoughts regarding this concept. So this is a Bunt commander for blue, white, green and 2 generic. It has flying, it's a free human avatar ally, and that ally part will actually matter soon. But first, when Aang enters, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a creature card with mana value 4 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And when another creature you control leaves the battlefield, he transforms at the beginning of the next upkeep. Which, as I understood it, is actually a negative. You don't want him to flip. Do everything you can to make sure he doesn't flip. You see, the entire goal of this deck is basically Clone Storm. You cast Aang and you flip into something like an altered ego that it becomes a copy of Aang, and now you rinse and repeat where you dig through your entire library. As we have cards like Flesh Duplicate, Glass Pool Mimic. When you have entered the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, except it's a shapeshifter rogue in addition to the other types. So if you flip into this, you will create a new Aang trigger and keep flipping for more clones. Like this one. Now here, you may have Yavari Shapeshifter enter the battlefield as a copy of any ally creature on the battlefield. And remember, Aang at the Crossroads is an ally, so she actually works. We also play Phantasmal Image and Phyrexian Metamorph, Sakashima the Impostor, which actually takes us to the perfect next step. So next to Sakashima here, we have Roaming Throne. It's also a 4 CMC creature, so you can put it into play with your commander. Because the problem with this commander is that, sure, you're flipping into all your clones, but they are just dying to the legendary rule, except Sakashima the Impostor. He actually doesn't die to the legendary rule, but you can see something of the problem. You're not really getting anywhere with this until you have something like a Roaming Throne that can double the triggers from your commander's ETB. So now you're flipping twice, which means that you can gain more value and gaining a clone, keep digging and keep building. We also have Katara the Fearless. She's Bunt and she's perfectly built to work with this, and it's kinda lovely how they both come together here. If a triggered ability of an ally you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time, just like Roaming Throne. So now you can like flip into Yavari Shapeshifter, that will make 2 more triggers for your commander as there are 2 more ETBs, and keep on going. We also have Starfield Vocalist. If a permanent entered the battlefield cast a trigger ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. And yeah, if you have this in play, you get 2 Aang triggers. First look at 5, then look at 5 again, and take 2 creatures, gaining a clone and something different, and keep on value and storming. So I think you can see the concept of this build, but there are a few more cards we need to go through. Like Restoration Angel. Now this is not a clone, this is a flicker creature. When this creature enters, you may exile target non-angel creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. This is going to flicker Aang, you keep the Restoration Angel, and you keep on digging. Same thing with Felida Guardian. You flicker Aang, you get a new Aang trigger, etc. If you actually have a ability that triggers twice here with Starfield Vocalist, you get 2 Felida Guardian triggers, so you can flicker like the original Aang, and then another clone, for example Sakashima the Impostor, that stays alive. By the way, you can actually keep all the clones, because if you have Felida Guardian in play and Aang in play, you have a Aang trigger, you get a clone, you make a copy of Felida Guardian instead of Aang, which will flicker the original Aang, And now it becomes easier to build a huge board state. We also have this one, Chameleon Master of Disguise. 4 mana, Mayhem, you may have a copy of anything. Yeah, he's a shapeshifter, he's a clone effect. Perfect, exactly what we want to have. And here's a thing, I mean, Wizards of the Coast are always printing more and more variations to the same effect in every new set, because they always believe that blue should have a clone in every set, give and take. So the power level of this commander could easily increase over time as Wizards of the Coast are printing more and more things that could synergize with this, basically increasing the EVO ratio, the chance of this hitting what you need to hit, because there is a chance that this will naturally break. Because there is just this accidental risk that you might flip into like a Esper Sentinel, a Mana Dork, or no clone effects basically, so you can't keep going, you get stuck, so to say. And in these situations you need to flicker Aang somehow. You already have the chance of drawing into clones, which means you can cast a clone and get a ETB effect of Aang again, but you also have things like Emil the Blessed that can basically sit there and just flicker Aang in general. Yeah, kinda perfect. But this is also a perfect food chain commander. And here food chain is actually individually quite good on its own without any food chain creatures. Because you can exile Aang into food chain, gaining a lot of mana, then exile another creature and now you can recast Aang from the command zone. And if you brick, food chain will help you return Aang to the command zone while give you mana to recast it, helping you storm through the situations where you didn't flip into any clone. The sad part about this enchantment is that you can't put it into play with your commander, you can only take creatures. But hey, you could naturally draw into this or use the power of white to tutor for it with an enlightened tutor. But obviously if you have Mist Hollow Griffin that can be casted from exile with food chain, you have infinite creature mana and you can cast your commander infinitely. Perfect. So we have a win con attempt by casting the commander from the command zone, or a value gain from casting the commander from the command zone, together with all possible flicker effects. For example, Essence Flux. Exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So you can flicker Aang, so to say. And then we have the possibility to just win with food chain. Perfect! But then what? What are we going to do once we have infinite Aang, so to say? How do we win this? The answer is somewhat Gaia's Cradle. You tap this for an enormous amount of mana, and you activate it, or you use the mana to activate Emil the Blessed, that we've gained from Aang, casting Aang infinitely. And you use that activation to target Flicker Fella the Guardian. When Fella the Guardian enters the battlefield, you may exile another target permanent you control, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control, which means that Fella the Guardian will flicker Gaia's Cradle, making it come into play untapped. So with Aang, we can get Fella the Guardian into play as well, but we can't get Gaia's Cradle into play unless you've already land dropped Cradle into play. But Aang can find Spellseeker. When Spellseeker enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an instant or sorcery card with convert mana cost 2 or less, reveal it and put it into your hand. With that, you find Crop Rotation. Now you can't use the food chain mana to cast crop rotations, so you might need to have some tricks or some extra mana available to you, so to make sure you can actually cast this thing. But like for 1 green mana here, you cast crop rotation and then you gain the Gaia's Cradle, and now you have infinite mana and infinite flicker and untaps. Then with Emil the Blessed, you flicker Spellseeker again, so you can tutor for Final of Devastation, which you go X equals infinite because you have infinite mana with Gaia's Cradle and Emil and Fella the Guardian, and you attack and win with infinite creatures. And if Final of Devastation is in your graveyard because you needed it to get a tutor effect, a key creature you needed to win the game, then use Eternal Witness, you flicker Eternal Witness, and you return the card to your hand. Now if you also had the color identity of red, you could loop a lightning bolt here infinitely. You can't do that because you're not allowed to play lightning bolt, but you get the concept. There's lots of different variations of ways to finalize the victory once you reach the state of now I can cast Aang infinitely. But that's the build. That's the concept. You ritual out, or you mana dork out, to be more correct here in this case, Aang into play, you accumulate value, you flip into cool stuff, you keep flipping, if you draw or tutor into food chain, you just storm through until Mist Hollow Griffin, or you figure something out along the way. But you can kinda see how you are potentially winning by casting Aang, the commander, for 5 mana Bunt from the command zone. So how good is this? Honestly, I'm skeptic. I don't know if you've heard of Etali, if you've accidentally missed it, but some of you might be sitting here and going like, oh, this is gonna be my favorite matchup with my Etali deck, because Etali flip cards from your opponents, and every single clone inside this build is another Etali flip. This is literally Bunt Etali, or trying to be Bunt Etali. But truth be told, flipping cards from your opponent's deck is stronger, or I shouldn't say stronger, but the concept that you're gaining 4 cards compared to just gaining 1 out of 5. Now Aang, you get to choose, so there's a chance you get what you want. However, in my experience, Etali wins pretty good. It's a strong commander. If we take a look at this leaderboard, you can see that Etali is performing quite good. It is high up in the top, with a current tournament win rate from top 16 of 33.3. So yeah, I don't think Aang is going to outperform Etali. Sure, we do have lots of different counter spells in this build as we're playing blue. We have things like Pact of Negation, we have Silence, we have Swan Song. Voice of Victory is actually quite good. Having Grand Abolisher effects is really good. And the part where you're casting or flickering Aang and you put a Voice of Victory into play, that's pretty amazing. Because your opponents can't really stop it. It's like counterspell Aang or face the risk of Aang producing this. But if I'm gonna be honest, I think that Etali will do the exact same thing as this commander, but a little bit better. The win ratio I've seen with Etali is pretty amazing. I have games where I just cast Etali and accidentally win. Another problem I can see with this build is that you can accidentally brick quite easily. For example, you cast Aang, you flip into a clone, and then you just repeat until you flip into something more. If you eventually flip into Katara or the Starfield Vocalist, then you stop. You need to recast Aang somehow, you need to rebuild, and you could also just accidentally flip into a Bird of Paradise. So I do truly think that this build has problems of making sure that this build gets going. Another concern I have is that, well, there's a lot of clones. This is just clone tribal. And sure, if you're playing against opponents with really good creatures, if you're playing in a metagame with opponents with really good creatures that you want to clone, like Doxady, no, that's banned, never mind. But okay, truly, if you're playing in a metagame with a lot of creatures that is good to clone, then yeah, you're not sitting with an entirely dead deck. Because for this deck to kind of function, your commander have to be in play and doing what it's supposed to do. For example, we have this card Cloud Shift. Excite target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. It does nothing, unless you have Commander Aang in play. If you have that, then the card is great. If you don't, then it's just a dead card. So I think this deck is extremely commander-centric, where you need to have your commander doing what it's supposed to do in order to function. One good thing about this is that it actually plays through counter spells and stacks pretty good, because you're just resolving triggers, you're just putting a new clone into play. This is truly a Yu-Gi-Oh deck, if I'm going to be honest. You're not creating any heuristic study triggers, hard to counterspell. You're just sitting there and herp-de-durdling. Ultimately, I think it's gonna be a fun commander. And a cool commander. I think it's gonna be pretty awesome doing what it's doing once it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But a problem or an argument I want to say, I've seen a lot of commanders like this where yes, it works, it has a concept, it has a cEDH thing that it can do. But just because it can do the cEDH thing doesn't mean that that's what you should be doing.